Hello, Zach. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's fantastic. When I met you down in London and when we were on the panel for the Finding the Money film, one of the things that you said to me was when you're asked a question about the economy, you never normally got more than 2 minutes to give an answer. So when you said that, I thought, Zach needs an hour to give an answer for these economic questions. So you've got as long as you want tonight to get to the heart of some of these really deep and important topics around our economy, our society, and our climate crisis and everything that's kind of combined. And also, I promise you at no point will I butt in when you're saying anything and say, but how are you going to pay for it, Zach? How are you going to pay for it? Which I know is another pet peeve of you, me, and everyone watching the show.
It happened to me the other night on Newsnight, literally. I didn't even get 2 minutes. I got about 20 seconds.
So those are a couple of promises I make to you and to your audience. To start kind of as broad as I can, when people ask you about the economy, what does that mean, that word? What does it mean to you? And do you think it means something different to the person who's asking it, or maybe even the audience for that question? Is it too broad a word for us to really be talking about? What's your thoughts on that?
It's undoubtedly too broad to mean anything sensible, and it depends who you're talking to. So if you're talking to an academic or someone, deeply entrenched in these things, then it means household management. If you're talking on the news, they always talk about the economy, but it's always this kind of amorphous thing. Is the economy doing well? Is the economy doing badly? But very rarely is that actually dived into in terms of what are you actually talking about? What are the things you are measuring? And when you say, is it doing well for whom? Are you talking about the very wealthiest in society? Are you talking about the poorest? Are you talking about the politicians? Are you talking about people's pensions? So there's a whole conversation around there. I think what does it mean to me? I think it's important that if we're talking about the economy, I think generally I'm always trying to think about the people who are most marginalized in anything I do. So for me, the economy, if you're asking me really specifically, would always be when someone gets up in the morning, can they afford food on the table? Can they afford to heat the house? Is transport affordable for them? Are they able to get to work? Are they able to get a job? So it's very much these kind of day-to-day things, which often get labeled as the cost of living crisis. Crisis is the wrong word because it implies a short, sharp shock, as opposed to things have been going pretty wrong in this area for a long time. And also, I don't really think it's the cost of living. I think it's more an inequality crisis, because actually there are people in our economy, to use that word again, who are doing better than they ever have before. And in fact, during the pandemic, they really benefited from what was supposedly a disaster, whereas other people were further entrenched into deep, deep poverty. So it's complicated. It does depend who you're talking to. And I think we could find much more useful terms for the things we're talking about. A term that I've increasingly found interesting, and I'm sure we'll get onto this. In fact, I was going to say maybe I should wait for more questions, but I've gone there now.
You've got an hour. If you're on the flow, go for it.
Right. This idea of post-growth. So first of all, I think the biggest problem with the idea of growth is when Keir Starmer was challenged during the election, or just before the election, by a group of young climate activists who were asking him about the very future of the planet. The question could not be more existential. And his kind of very glib response was, I'm on the side of economic growth. Now, we could have a whole conversation about what economic growth is, but the fact he would respond to a question about sustainability, ecological collapse, and the environment by just talking about growth, I think is deeply problematic. But I think on top of that, when you talk about being degrowth or anti-growth, people understandably get scared by that. And I also don't think it quite accurately describes what we should be looking to do. And I think post-growth is a really interesting term, because it's saying, let's move past this idea of economic growth and actually talk about what do we want from our lives. Do we want better mental health outcomes for citizens? Do we want people to feel more cohesive communities? Do we want to deal with the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, the disability pay gap? Do we want to make sure that people have lives live with purpose? There's lots of different ways you can measure these things, but I would say they are all infinitely more helpful than growth and GDP. And of course, you'll know better than I did, but the person who came up with the whole concept of GDP says that is a terrible way to measure the happiness and well-being of a nation and of a community. So I think we've got to move past those ideas. And I think it's a really nice phrase because it describes it quite well. And also it implies, and is true, that we're building on making things better rather than trying to return to things as they were, because things have never been that great for some of the poorest people anyway. So we've got to move to a new type of economy.
Well, we'll definitely come back to growth, post-growth. degrowth, green growth, sustainable growth. We'll do all that. We'll have a growth section. But to kind of go back to that main idea about the economy, when you were talking your first couple of minutes there, at one point you could easily have said society, what's happening in our society, but you chose the word economy, what's happening in our economy. And I think that's something that we've really got to start talking about, is just to say to people, the economy is just a way of doing things within a society. We need to be much broader with our conversation and talk about our society. And I think I also wanted to get your thoughts on the recent election in America, and not the kind of politicized of it. But one thing I wanted your direct thoughts on was that there is a narrative that the Democrats were talking about growth and the economy doing really well, and the Republicans were speaking about inflation being high and the cost of living being high, and and unemployment rising. These things that people can kind of connect with. So in terms of that narrative, how powerful do you think those two slightly different narratives are, and do you see any change that's maybe going to happen in the UK after what happened in the States?
So much to say. That's a brilliant question. I think first of all, to come back to the society point, totally taken. And I would also use the word community, which is a word that frequently in my day-to-day conversations I talk about communities that make up a society. I think, and this will probably run throughout our conversation, I suspect, this evening, it depends who you're talking to and what you're trying to convince them of, or what argument you're trying to win, or what narrative you are trying to foreground. Because when people hear from someone like me, and when I say someone like me, I mean someone on the left, someone progressive, someone from the Green Party, that's specific, a Green Party politician, they expect me to talk about community, they expect me to talk about society. And so sometimes when I'm talking to a broader audience, to say those words sometimes means that I'm effectively not using the breath that I've got, or the words that I've got, to talk about things that people might not expect me to talk about. So the economy, for instance, is something that people don't often expect Green Party politicians to talk about, although it's at the center of everything we do. This idea there's no environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice too. These things are entirely intersectional, they're entirely connected. So it's always important to be talking about the economy. But if you're talking about what really matters, and where we need to be talking about kind of in terms of our organizing spaces, then absolutely society and community, I think, has to be the way forward there. In terms of what's happened in America, a few thoughts. So, I mean, all through the election, it really, really reminded me of David Cameron and George Osborne during the Brexit years over here in the UK or in Europe more generally, where you were talking to people who had been deeply punished by years of austerity, deeply struggling, deeply unhappy with the state of the nation, not trusting politicians, not trusting the economy in inverted commas. And what was David Cameron's central message? Stay in Europe and everything will stay the same. We will not rock the boat, but if we leave Europe, everything's going to change, and that kind of project fear. Now, just to put my cards on the table, I campaign for Remain. I still think remaining in the European Union, although not perfect, and we can have a whole conversation about that, like there's huge issues with the European Union, particularly in some of the subjects we're going to talk about tonight, and how they behave towards Greece, for instance, that I think are deeply problematic and revealing of where a lot of the ideology is. However, and similar conversation with COP29 right now, journalists have obsessively asked me recently, do we need to leave the COP process? And you kind of go, the COP process is totally not working and totally not doing what it's aimed for. I will get back to Brexit, by the way. I'm not doing that politician thing. I'm just weaving some things in. COP just really isn't working. But then I do think we need to listen to the people in the island nations and indigenous communities that are saying we really need COP. We need politicians, world leaders to come together and make decisions that affect the very future of our planet in terms of funding, loss and adaptation, mitigation, and all the various other areas. The problem is that it's been entirely infested with fossil fuel companies, vested interests, and lack of transparency. So the question becomes, how do you reform the COP process from within it? And that's not easy. And I think it would be disingenuous for me to pretend it's easy. And walking away would sound easy or simplistic, but I also think would create many more problems than remaining within the process and pushing for reforming the process and to get a better outcome. And I feel exactly the same about the European Union, that there are big issues, but I think we were much better within that tent being able to reform it than effectively what we've done now, which is cut ourselves off. We're still being affected by many of the big decisions. There's the rise of the far right across Europe, and we're seeing that happen. And it feels a little bit like we're kind of shouting and worrying about it outside of the tent. So that's the first thing with the American election. I just thought the Democratic messaging was awful, which just seemed to be, in fact, I think Kamala Harris was asked on The View, which is like their equivalent of our Loose Women, what would be different between a Harris presidency and a Biden presidency? And the answer was absolutely nothing, or nothing would change. And then I think she had a few moments to think about it and said, well, I'll put Liz Cheney in the cabinet. For those who don't know Liz Cheney, she's complete war hawk, jingoist Republican. The idea that anyone would go, even a Republican would go, yes, that's who you need in the cabinet, was clearly a disastrous strategy. So I think there was an immense amount of complacency from the Democrats, and the idea that everything was okay, and a refusal to connect with the public. On the other hand, you have the Republicans' message, which ultimately was that the economy wasn't working for people and that things needed to work. And what you could almost argue is a populist message. And we could get into this whole conversation about populism. And that often gets rejected by the left, the progressive people, the idea of populist. And I think we need to reclaim that, because populist just means, well, or could mean it is popular. And I think we need to look at, I think Naomi Klein, in fact, said today, I've been talking about this for a while, what does eco-populism look like? What does a populism of both economics that speaks to working class communities and marginalized ethnic minority communities, or whoever the marginalized community is, and also protects the planet and speaks to that? So we completely refuse this framing of net zero being something that hits people's pockets, but actually talk about how we can reduce bills through installing heat pumps that the government should be subsidizing, how creating jobs is a perfect way to make sure that people are in trade unions, that their working conditions are right, that they're being treated with dignity, that they're being paid properly. And so I think we can completely transform that conversation. I don't think Republicans did that, but I think what they did do was they spoke to people's needs and they spoke to people's fears. And then the final thing I would say on this is, you know, I'm sure this has come across, but in case not, I think Donald Trump is a severe danger to the planet. And I think that people who watch him get a sense that he's being honest. Now, I do think he's being intensely dishonest about lots of things, but I think the honesty is in he speaks his mind. What's coming to him at any moment is what he speaks, and you don't get a huge sense that this is someone who is very censored. On the other hand, with the Democrats, you get this idea of a very manufactured Hollywood performance where they literally have Beyonce coming on stage and everything feels very stage managed. I think a lot of this election was about authenticity and people wanting to connect with people who really meant what they said and really believed what they said. And so, you know, it's easy in hindsight for me to go, these are all the lessons I think I have for the Democrats. But I think it is quite clear where they went wrong. And the very final thing, sorry, the epilogue to this is Keir Starmer is making literally every single same mistake. So that sense that he's not being sincere, he's not creating, or he's tinkering at the edges and not talking about the real transformation that our society needs. And all that's doing is creating a huge space for reform on the right, or Kemi Badenoch if reforms sink. And that makes me deeply worried for the future of this country. Of course, my hope is that the Green Party will continue to grow. Organized movements, community grassroots movements will continue to organize, and I think together we can defeat this right-wing populism. But I don't think we do it by not being popular. I think you clearly have to have a movement that becomes popular or continues to be popular.
Fantastic. How did that feel, not being interrupted?
I wondered how you had got on convincing people in the Green Party about how a fiat currency works and what the limitations are, and also what the possibilities are for example, just societal change, as well as obviously a Green New Deal.
So I'm going to give an unsatisfying answer, which is going to be the first minute, and then I'll give a much more satisfying answer. But I need to do the unsatisfying bit, which is I'm sure that you'll know this, and lots of people watching this might know this, but some people won't. That the Green Party didn't used to have leadership at all. It used to have what was called primary speakers. So the idea was, because we're essentially a flat structure where no member has more kind of say or hard power than any other member, we just had people who effectively spoke for the policies of a membership. So the Green Party has one member, one vote. any single member can propose policy to our conference floor, and that then has a debate, and then it gets voted on. If it's voted for, then that effectively becomes our policy. If it gets voted against, I think it can't come back for 6 months, and it has to slightly change form. So in the past, when something became policy, it was effectively then the job of the primary speaker to say, this is our Green Party policy, I am speaking it. If I disagree with something, when they were primary speaker, they would have to say, even though I'm a primary speaker, this is the bit I disagree with, here's the party policy, here's what I think, and they would have to make that distinction. There was then an almighty row that I wasn't in the party for. This was a few decades ago, or maybe not even that long ago, where people decided they wanted leadership because the media just didn't understand what this primary speaker stuff was. Like, they'd say, can we speak to your leader? And the Green Party would go, we don't have a leader, we've got primary speakers. So whole internal conversation, and then effectively it was decided actually it's time now to have leaders. And I think that was very contentious for a while. I don't think it's contentious at all anymore, and I think the party have got used to it. But the reason why I'm saying all of this is, speaking as deputy leader, I come from a context where policy is decided by the membership. It's decided in working groups, where working groups of experts or people with a huge interest in things get together, and they can propose policy too, and then that's called accredited policy, and there's a whole kind of thing. On top of that, the Green Party of England and Wales is a separate party to the Scottish Green Party. So I make it as a rule generally in media to not talk about issues going on in Scotland because it's essentially not for me to interfere. That being said, the much more satisfying answer is I could hear in all of your question there, you're not asking me to interfere, but I just wanted to kind of make that clear at the outset. Where have I got to in terms of fiat currency and the way that we look at our economy? Well, I think this would be a game changer, because anyone who's been in politics for more than 30 seconds knows that the most typical question you get about anything is, how are you going to pay for that? And this constant kind of obsession with, if you are going to spend or if you are going to make policies that are good for society, people going, well, what taxes are you going to change, and what are you going to do there? Now, I think it's always really clear to point out that we do need to tax people, but taxation is ultimately about tackling inequality and resource management. It is not the way to spend or to create money, or to create money through taxation. But of course, we can create money through making sure that we're looking at both fiscal policy, but more importantly, monetary policy. And I think it's always important, I think they call it consolidated strategy, that those two things can work and must work together. And so there's often been these myths created around, we've just been talking about the economy and about how things can get conflated, because I think it's helpful for politicians to be able to go, we can't afford that, or the magic money tree, or that big bold idea could possibly never happen in our society, in our community, because it's just too expensive. And I think as soon as you remove that argument, things get much more exciting, because you go, the status quo isn't working, let's completely transform the status quo. And of course, the people who are in power, by their nature, are often the status quo, or they have interest in protecting the status quo because it's what got them to power in the first place. So then it becomes very scary, any idea of any economic transformation. Now, maybe that's a more cynical view of this. I think the probably much more honest view of this is, I think a lot of politicians just don't have time to understand things or have conversations beyond common sense. And I'm really putting common sense there in inverted commas.
I'm going to press you a little bit more on this. What I specifically want to know, because this is something that I'm busy with personally as well, is how are you convincing your party to understand that taxes in a monetary sovereign state don't fund spending per se, they are for social engineering purposes, and allowing them to free up their minds to understand what's possible and also what's not possible.
Yeah, so I think that's partly why I gave the caveat, because in some ways it's not my job to no, that's not true. So it's my job to influence, which is why I'm doing podcasts like this. But actually, when I meet the taxation and fiscal policy working group or monetary policy, they do get this, and this is understood already. Okay. And I think this is understood, even into How to Win the War, I think, already has the kind of roots of what you need to kind of be looking at what you could do to transform. I was about to use the word economy again. I can use the word economy in this sense because everyone knows what I'm talking about. I think there's a separate question there to have, and this is one I've had with William on that panel, which is when you're talking to the electorate and when you're talking to voters, what is the context that you talk into? And I experienced this with the climate crisis as well, by the way. So you have where you understand the science, or you understand the science as best you can and as best the science understands itself. And of course, there's often disagreement with all of these things, whether we're talking about economics or whether we're talking about climate science. But there is also very broad agreement on lots of things. So I think you start with the broad agreement. I'm talking about the climate crisis here, with scientific consensus about what needs to happen. And so you then go, how do I communicate this with the public? And you go, if you communicate it with the fearfulness and the urgency that it really needs to be communicated with, there is a danger you would absolutely paralyze people with fear, and people would sense that everything was wrong and everything was a complete disaster. And you almost feed into the hands of where I suspect the Conservative right will go, but also the Labour Party to some extent, which is disaster capitalism, or as Grace Blakely put it, I think in a book, vulture capitalism. This idea of essentially accepting that there's a climate crisis, but we can just make more money on this climate crisis we can just build more defences, or we can have these huge infrastructure projects that don't come from public funding but come from the private sector. And I'm already hearing that in London, where I chair the Environment Committee, where I ask about big projects around green infrastructure, and the answer almost is that this will never come from a public purse. We're going to need to convince private infrastructure, or we will need to inject public sector funding into private infrastructure. I should make the distinction, which I know you'll know, but just to demonstrate or to clarify, that in London it is slightly different, because there it is more like a household budget, and because obviously a state or a regional budget is different for a national economy. So there are genuine, there are genuine worries there about, does the budget have enough money? But my argument, when you've got a Labour mayor and you have a Labour government, is then you should be convincing your Labour government to handle this completely differently and create the money that it needs, because that will create the investment and will create the if your goal is economic growth, and I've just been talking about how I don't think that's a good goal, but even if your goal is economic growth, then it makes absolutely no sense to not be spending money when there is these huge opportunities to spend lots of money and create lots of jobs that would drive that economic growth. But obviously I don't think that's the means to the end.
So you think that the political education, or rather the economic education, is there within your party because you have a group of people who are doing that education within the party, and they're going round branches and talking to them about, what how this works, and that they're not thinking about solving the climate crisis within the constraints of thinking about the state as a household. That understanding is starting to spread in the Green Party in England. Is that correct?
I feel like it's more than spread. I feel like there's
it's understood. You feel it's understood?
A fundamental that the national economy is not a household budget, I think, is well understood. And I think that is largely well understood because of the disaster that was 2010 to 2026. Obviously, you could talk it was going on before that, and it's been going on since then. But I think David Cameron and George Osborne, by obsessively talking about that household credit card, made the metaphor there to be destroyed. Now, the next question on top of that is, do the media and the political class understand that? Absolutely not. You hear these metaphors around credit cards completely and all the time. And so I think the question then, as a party or as any politician goes, do you continue to keep fighting that in a way where the public intuitively understand and believe that credit card metaphor? And do you play within those false boundaries, recognizing those are false boundaries, and still make it work? Or do you spend your political time and space ultimately deconstructing that metaphor? Now, I've created a false binary because I think you absolutely do both. And so, for instance, when we talk about a wealth tax, I'm very happy to talk about a wealth tax in terms of, we were talking about a 1% tax on assets of £10 million or more to bring in money that could be spent on our public services. Now, I often say could be spent because there are other ways to put on those public services. Now, on another day, I could equally argue that a wealth tax of 1% is not nearly enough, because if the point of a wealth tax is to tackle inequality, then a tiny amount of a wealth tax, which is how you justify the wealth tax by saying this is just a small amount, is not achieving what it needs to tackle inequality. However, I think it is a medium story that makes sense, which both moves slightly out of the household budget narrative, talks about tackling inequality, and makes instinctive sense to the voter that you're taking money away from the wealthiest and you're using that on public services. You also then need to be very, very clear that you don't need the wealth tax to do that. That is just one mechanism of many mechanisms of which you can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very keen to, I'm also a councillor in Aberdeen. I'm very keen that the public understand the reality of how things work. And I'm certainly not of a mind that, you have to try and be gentle with them because somehow they're intellectually not capable of understanding how the fiscal and monetary system work. Can the Green Party pull in the working classes? Because the working classes are the big vote that you need to have in order to get a more progressive policy.
Yeah, so I think two things there. I think the first thing to respond to we need to talk to people as if they're intelligent and they understand. And I couldn't agree more. I think there's a phrase I love. I think it might have been Tony Benn, but don't quote me on that, where he said politicians are best when they're teachers. Now, I would modify that phrase because I don't think we should just be teachers. I think there's a real important thing there about listening, although I'd argue that the best teachers do that anyway. But you shouldn't just be transmitting information. You should also be receiving information. But I think the general point, actually, that it's not your job to find a crowd, see which direction they're going and run to the front of it and say, I'm leading. It's your job to see where people are at, consider the evidence, see where we need to go to, and then make convincing and compelling arguments that treat people with intellect and with the thought capacity that people have. Now, are some people too busy to deal with politics? I think that's a slightly different question. And I think particularly true in working class communities. Not all working class communities, plenty of working class people are very engaged with politics and are very informed on all of these things. I think there are lots of working class people who are incredibly intelligent and uninformed politically because they're worrying about heating food on the table, the kind of basics. And so I think that comes to your question. How do you reach people who are starting to disengage from the whole process or have never engaged with the whole process? Completely understandably, because it's full of charlatans, full of nonsense, full of point scoring. And I can completely understand why people, if they had any faith in the first place, have lost complete faith in what they're seeing. And we see this, I think, again, the danger with Keir Starmer's Labour government, a man who ran on the coattails of Jeremy Corbyn, ran on a kind of left populist agenda to transform the economy, to give rights to trade unionists and workers, to transform the voting system, to create a more participatory democracy. All really, really good, brilliant stuff. And then before he was even elected as Prime Minister, ditched almost every single pledge. And then as Prime Minister just seems to be taking us in another direction entirely. You can understand why people disengage. Next point. I see it as my biggest mission with the Green Party, along with the team, not just on working class diversity, but also on ethnic diversity, that there is an old stereotype that the Green Party is too white, too middle class, too educated. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why I say it's an old stereotype is because when people sometimes say this from within the party, I both agree with them that we need more, but I also point out that there are many, many working class people in the party and or people of colour who are elected, who are doing good work. And actually, when people say there's no diversity in the party, they're raising their contribution. I can think some of them who literally say to me, we're right here. And people in the room go, where are the working class people? Where are the people of colour? And we're like, we're here working really hard. Can we rephrase this to how do we grow? How do we get bigger? How do we include more people? And I think that's a completely fair challenge. How do we do this? Well, I think the good news here is a quick thought experiment, that if it was the 1960s or 1970s and we didn't have mass inequality, imagine that we sorted everything out. Working class people got the rights that they were campaigning for, people of colour, we kind of tackled racism and inequality, and everything was really good, but we didn't know about the climate crisis. Forward on to 2024, and you discover the climate crisis. That's a really hard ask to people to say we need to change everything, because people will go, I'm really comfortable in my life. I feel really satisfied. I feel like my whole community is really, really good. Why would we change everything? We are not in that scenario. We are in a scenario where there is deep unhappiness, where there is mass inequality, where everything needs to change anyway. But we also have this moment where, because of the climate crisis, we need to completely transform our society, and we need to completely transform the way we do things. So things like a home insulation program, which is a triple win. It creates jobs, vital in the cost of living crisis. It reduces emissions. And also it's a really good opportunity to create whole new industries. Port Talbot, I was there in Wales months before the steelworkers all lost their jobs. It was very obvious what was about to happen, and no one seemed to be planning for it. And when I say no one, obviously, people in the Green Party were, but the decision makers were not planning for it. And so it's completely predictable what was going to happen. That could have been a moment to nationalize the steel industry. That could have been a moment to go, let's put huge investment into our industries, huge investment into public investment, rather than relying or even letting the private sector get away with it and do all sorts of things. Nationalizing the water companies, nationalizing the energy companies, all of this work that needs to happen, and the railways. And so I think we've got this moment where everything's coming together, and it's absolutely dying and speaking out for a narrative that includes working class people, that more than includes, places them at the center of it, places inequality at the center of it. Just before this call, I had a meeting this evening with a child poverty group who were talking about the child poverty figures, particularly in London, but obviously this is going on all over England and Wales, and indeed particularly prevalent in Scotland. And so just the fact that we live in a society that has shrugged off child poverty or sees it as baked in, rather than this should be the absolute thing, the measure that if you lift the poorest people, and children are going to be in that category by the nature that they can't work. So if you lift the poorest people, the most marginalized in our society, that is going to improve everything for everyone. It's the opposite of trickle-down economics. It's improving people's basic standards.
I'd like us to talk a little bit more about the main Green Party policies. You know, you mentioned nationalisation there of the kind of the old utilities. Do you want to just give us a few more kind of, I suppose, the kind of keynote Green Party policies?
Yeah, so I've already mentioned a wealth tax. I think alongside a wealth tax is carbon taxes. Now, again, the conversation we were just having, the carbon taxes are not to generate wealth. The carbon taxes are essentially signaling mechanisms to the market to say, stop doing the bad thing, let's incentivize the good thing. So a very obvious one that I want to talk about more, so I'm going to use this opportunity, is to tax jet fuel. It's absolutely absurd that we are subsidizing aviation, and the fact that private jets even exist, that's a whole other thing. I'm pleased that the government are taxing them more now, but actually, I think when you really take a step back, why does a private jet exist? It just is unconscionable. Now, people will sometimes say, but what about emergency medical care, or for security reasons, for whatever reason? They're not private jets. So we're literally talking about the very wealthy, the very, very super rich being able to pollute, fly above picket lines, fly above food banks. I think that is literally the pinnacle of climate injustice. Anyway, so taxing jet fuel, but also generally not freezing fuel duty, etc., and moving people to better modes of transport, and essentially subsidizing train travel. I think on top of that, a universal basic income has been a flagship policy for a long time. I'm sure people who are watching this podcast are already aware of what a UBI is. So in 20 seconds, ultimately making sure that everybody, no matter whether they're in work, not in work, are given a basic amount of money that should cover their essentials. What you place that at, I'd love to see a citizens' assembly on and more workings on. Something we've talked about in the past, along with Guy Standing, is something roughly around £400 a week. So you're kind of putting it at like living wage, so that'd be between £1,200, £1,600 a month. It's really important to say, though, there you would need what's called the ratchet mechanism of making sure that people are better off. So if someone is disabled right now and they're on benefits, it would be really important that if the universal basic income was brought in, that those people are better off than they are now. And when people have modelled this, it looks like most of the population, because of the way inequality works, would be better off than they are now. The people who would be worse off because they would be getting taxed more would be, again, the super rich. Putting in the distinction there that they are not taxed more to pay for the basic income. We can pay for that anyway. Ultimately, the only thing you need to watch there is inflation. And as you know very well, inflation is more about making sure that we have the material resources, and that is being managed so we're not running out of things, and we're also limiting price gouging. Other policies that I think are really important. Proportional representation does not seem like an economic policy, but actually I think it is vital to open up the democratic space. And there is lots of work done to say that countries with proportional representation around the world have 18% less carbon emissions, they are less likely to go to war, and have more equal economies. Now, I don't think that is proportional representation itself. I think, if you have a more fair voting system, it doesn't fix all of those things. But what it does do, I think, is create a culture and an environment in which you have compromise compromise or negotiated solutions where people have to have difficult conversations and reach points of negotiation. I know that I'm talking to people who are Scottish, so will be well aware of this, but the argument that's often used against it is you will enable the far right, or you will allow them to be given seats. I think you only need to look at Westminster to see what's happened under a first past the post system. The far right have been able to get into Westminster. When they weren't in Westminster, they simply hijacked the government, and it was much easier for them to be able to do so in a first past the post system. If a small minority of people in this country want to vote for right-wing parties or even far-right parties, I don't like that one bit, but I would much rather they have seats in power where they are able to make their arguments and we are able to destroy their argument in a legitimate democratic way, rather than trying to silence people, which ironically starts to be merged with fascism anyway. If you're saying people are not allowed to say the things they want to say, obviously there are caveats that hate speech should not be allowed. It is not just an opinion, like it should not be allowed in Parliament. Other kind of key policies, I
Zack,
think,
see if you can give me two big ones before I come back on you in that little list. Okay, so just take a second, kind of two of the other big economic policies.
Yeah, so I think devolution would be a huge one in terms of, I experience this in London a lot, that I'm constantly saying to the mayor, can you do this? He responds to me with, I have no powers, or I have no cash. Now, I happen to think, I'm not come on this podcast to argue London should have more cash. I think that would be a very unpopular position, and also I think a wrong position. But I do think it should have the levers to be able to generate more cash. So things like a tourist tax, where again, I know we're going back to household budget models here, but we are talking about
currency.
Exactly. And so I think that kind of makes sense on that level. I'm not just talking about London here though, but I'm talking about every region, every space. I think it's really important that local democracy, whether that's hyperlocal or whether that's on the regional level, has more subsidiarity. And whilst the Green Party of England and Wales do not have a policy on Scottish independence, the Scottish Greens are pro-Scottish independence, the Green Party of England and Wales say that's a matter that's up to Scotland, and I do agree, but I'm personally very in favour of independence, because I think how can you possibly argue that power should not be at the most local possible level it can be. Other economic policies, I guess, a lot of these things come under carbon taxes again, but to be more specific, a road user charging model. So in London, again, we've experienced the ultra low emission zone, which has reduced traffic on the roads and has cleaned up the air. There is also legitimacy to the fact that it is a blunt instrument, that you're just blanket taxing everyone, whether you're driving once a day or 5 times a day, or no matter how far you're driving. And I think to start getting more specific about the way that we tax people through their road user, again, not to generate income, although you could argue if it's at the regional level, that money could then be spent straight back into public services. But I think it's a much more wide principle, which is the polluter pays. And again, you are incentivizing people to move away from their private vehicle and back onto their public transport. Just that social care is often the poor cousin of the National Health Service, and although it's not a strict economic policy, it absolutely everything is economic, right? And everything is health, because at the moment, far too many people, and the burden in inverted commas, often falls on women, where caring responsibilities are not seen as work and they're not seen as a job. But actually, if you took all of those people out of the work they're doing, the economy would completely collapse. And so we absolutely need to recognise both the role of social care, but also the role of unpaid carers and those people who are putting that work in, which ultimately, what more important job could you have in our society than a care job, which is ultimately a green job and is what makes our communities work.
Great. Well, let's pick up on that last one then, because I'm going to give you my summary of being of thinking I couldn't see a radical policy amongst that at all, and it was very much all framed within this kind of pretty much not quite neoclassical, but certainly capitalist framing. You talk about nationalisation, which is going back to like the 1970s, the 1980s as your policy. Taxes, not banning anything, but taxes. That's not radical. PR and devolution, yeah, but again, they're not real economic policies that we're talking about. A tourist tax, yeah, that's not going to make a significant difference to the economy. Road users and using tax again and how they incentivize. None of these are particularly big, inspiring ideas, apart from UBI, which it's not a hugely popular policy among MMTers who much prefer a job guarantee with that perhaps a UBI at the base. So in saying all that, I'm kind of going to say to you, I was hoping you'd be talking about very low interest rates, a job guarantee scheme, actually paying people for care, not charging for university education in England, making sure we've got targets to remove poverty, drastically reduce inequality. These kind of big, inspiring, big, meaty, let's get rid of the fiscal rules. These are the things I would be hoping we'd be talking about, especially with your kind of wider understanding of the economy. So if I misunderstood, am I just not listening? Am I just being just a little bit too radical and these things will never work? I'd love a little feedback from you on those points before we move on.
Yeah, so a few things there. One, and it's by the by, but we want to abolish tuition fees. Education should be free because it should be a right and not a privilege. I disagree with the characterization of all of it, but I will still answer in the frame that you've done. But I do think it would be radical to have proportional representation in this country because it would mean that everyone's vote would count. And that would give us an actual democracy where we could start to do things like media reform, abolish the House of Lords and make people elected. And you could start to, that is a radical move to start making more radical policy. It is a step along the way. I think I mentioned before, to insulate every single home in Britain that needs it and to create those jobs. I think green infrastructure, renewable energy, a Green New Deal, I think all of these things are quite radical if you start from where we are at right now. And I think this is the distinction, to come to your question directly. And I don't think it's that you've misunderstood, but unless I may be mistaken, I think it might be the difference between running for national election and getting voted and winning and being able to have a policy platform that people won't vote for because it seems too distant, too impossible. And so I think you can either go to where you want people to be and run there. And I think it's certainly a model of change. And I don't mean this in any way disparaging to people who do that. I think there's a really important role in our democratic and political and activism discourse in no compromises, no softening, let's go. It has historically failed though. And I think no one has we've never seen anyone really get elected in that manner. You could argue Jeremy Corbyn became leader on this kind of platform, and someone could argue that he didn't become prime minister, but I don't think he didn't become prime minister because he wasn't radical enough. I think that was much more around the first past the post system and his own party working really hard to sabotage him. But I also hear in the distinction that you've just made, you wouldn't consider Jeremy Corbyn's platform particularly radical either, because it's very similar to the platform I'm talking about, if I've understood.
So I think it's how we can push the electorate is those types of ideas, and you know, using all your kind of political nous and being elected and all that. Do you think there is that kind of limit that this is as far you can push, and it's more popular to say to a poor working class voter, we're going to tax private jets, than it is to say to them, we're going to ban private jets? How do you kind of come to that distinction where you feel you've got a point that you can't take this electorate that we want to educate and inform and treat as grown-ups? Why don't you think, again, it's not a deliberately leading question, but why don't you think there's a point where we can take the electorate, which is much further, much more radical, but policies which could land in a much more powerful way than, you know, taxing, than just increasing some taxes?
Yeah, so well, first of all, I want to ban private jets and I ban them in an instant, but I still take the point of what you're saying, and I'm on the record with Sadiq Khan having long, protracted conversations over the past few years around private jets, to the point that I think he thinks I'm obsessed with them, but again, it's their emissions, kind of in proportion to everything else, are tiny compared to home heating or to transport. Other forms of transport, again, it's just the principle of, if you allow that one to slip, then you are allowing inequality to be rubbed in people's faces. But anyway, to come to your question directly, because I hear what you're saying, there's lots of things I don't want to ban and I want to tax instead.
You mean there's lots of things you want to ban and you don't want to tax?
Lots of things I want to ban, but I don't want to tax. No. So, like, for instance, yeah, like, I think there's a legitimate argument that you should ban cars from central cities. Like, if the public transport are in place, other than people with disabilities, which is a separate conversation, but really important. How do you have a completely accessible public transport system, which is the way you include people with disabilities, that is affordable or even ideally free? I'd like to see us getting to the point where we have free public transport, and I don't think that's impossible.
Now you're talking.
Right. But that is a huge jump for people from the current model that we're in. And I think it's totally acceptable to move to a model that can be absolutely popular while you're still moving to that model, to say, well, we're going to make them cheaper, or we are going to cap bus fares, or we are going to reduce the amount of cars in. So you're always constantly evolving the conversation. And I guess I'll put it another way, which I don't know how this will go down on this podcast, but I used to be a huge American football fan. I just don't have time to sit and watch hours of games now. I guess rugby would be another equivalent, where the sport constantly is about moving a few steps forward and then getting pushed back again, and then moving forward and backwards. And sometimes that can feel like you're really at a status quo, or not status quo, you're treading water. It can feel frustrating. You're going, actually, it is really time to make the transformative change we need, a bold, radical program that excites people. Let's go for it. You just get pushed back. So you've instead got to find, how do you weave through the gaps and just find these little opportunities where you can create a broader conversation and you can create the bolder change we need. And then every so often you do just see a gap where you can see the touchline or whatever the goal line is. And then in that moment, you just go, now is the moment to go for it. Let's go. And by the way, I thought we were going to have one of these with Great British Energy. I thought, here's an interesting moment where we're finally going to do this. Of course, in Keir Starmer's office, we still don't know what Great British Energy is, but it's sounding more and more like it's just a privatization model, which sounds like it could even make things worse than where we are. But we need to wait to see what the detail is on that. But I think there's other things where
we've got another couple of questions. So I think you've given us a really good answer there. I'd like to see our politicians being a little bit more like quarterbacks and throwing the 90-yard passes rather than just edging forward and slope backwards. We've got a question from Charles. Do you have an opinion on what's the chances of education of the climate crisis actually getting through enough with, I suppose, the whole of our, not education in terms of schooling, but our whole of our society to actually start to mitigate I think that's the threat of the climate crisis?
So my depressing answer, first of all, I mentioned I was on Newsnight the other night and I was on to talk about the climate crisis of COP29. The other story they were covering that night was Justin Welby and the Church of England scandal. I was meant to be on for about 10 to 12 minutes, which is not enough time to talk about COP29, but one-on-one interview on BBC Newsnight, that's a start. They got so interested in the Justin Welby story, they gave that 32 minutes and they gave me 3.5 minutes. I think that speaks to where the media are at. And by the way, Justin Welby stepped down the next day anyway, so the whole conversation was completely pointless. Not completely pointless, that's unfair, but completely pointless in terms of Justin Welby's aspect of it. There is a whole conversation to have about inequality and the power imbalance in religion, separate conversation. But so I think we're up to a huge challenge here around the media. The media are not going to educate people on the climate crisis. And when they talk about the climate crisis, which are starting to increasingly, the solutions will always be privatized solutions, because the same people who donate to those privatized solutions, the political parties, are the same people who own the media. And I think the stat is something like 90% of the media is owned by 3 of the same controllers. So there is a real issue here about injustice and power. The good news, though, having got over the depressing answer, is we're going to have to do it anyway. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do it through podcasts. We're going to do it through independent media. We're going to do it through knocking on doors. We're going to do it through community organizing. I don't reject the question entirely, but in some ways we've got to reject the question. The question cannot be, are we going to do this? The question has to be, how are we going to do this if we're going to survive? So ultimately, anyone who cares about this or has the capacity to do it has to take responsibility to go, we are going to talk about the climate crisis, and we're going to talk about it in a way where people see it as an opportunity, in terms of we can transform the society we need to change in the way that I've talked about tonight, through tackling the climate crisis. And we just can't give in to the naysayers, and we can't give in to the very powerful corporate forces who it is in their interest to spread misinformation. And it means people like me just have to be better. We have to get better at the game. I put that in inverted commas all the time. Whereas if you're like an average politician or someone who is trying to protect the status quo, you are given a free pass. You are doing politics on easy mode. If you're trying to transform society in any kind of radical way, you have to be more articulate. You have to have more facts. You have to have more knowledge. And I think that's the challenge that is there for all of us who want to transform our society in a way that challenges the status quo and challenges capital.
Really? Well, you're certainly not an average politician, Zach. So I'm going to give you over in the hands of another person who's not an average politician, a better than average politician. Kieran, you've got the last 10 minutes for a couple of questions.
I'm going to come back to the concept of radical. I mean, radical as in proportional representation Yeah, it's radical for England. Unfortunately, England's an outlier in this respect with, the countries that are just across the water from us. It's something that they've been doing for a long time. So it's going to take me back to you obviously being in London and looking at council tax. Have you looked at that in the London Council? Because this is something that there's actually a lot of media about it here in Scotland at the moment, because we've had it for so long and we all know that it's regressive. So is the London Council looking at this at all?
Radicalism is relative, so it depends where you're starting off. So I totally accept that on PR. And to be honest, as soon as we had PR, my radical brain in inverted commas would go, okay, what's next? Participatory budgeting, you're always trying to push to the next step. In terms of council tax, so small distinction, but I'm elected for the London Assembly, so we are the regional strategic body, and we are not involved with council tax. Effectively, we get business rates that come to the Assembly, and that plays part of the mayor's budget. Council tax, though, is a regressive tax. We need to be looking at something like a land value tax, and that's absolutely something as a party we've been pushing. On top of that, Sian Berry, who's now the MP in Brighton, she was a councillor and former leader of the Green Party, or co-leader. When she was a councillor in Camden, she did a lot of work around writing off debt, like this absurd idea that if someone was in debt for council tax, they'd end up, essentially it's a poor tax, or you're being punished for your poverty. Same with prepayment meters. I think there's lots of things within our society where if someone is poor, they are then doubly punished, both for not being able to afford it in the first place and then again. And of course, you have companies like Klarna or pay-as-you-go companies, not pay-as-you-go credit debit companies, who are preying on people with this as well. So I think all of that badly needs reform. And I think just to flip to the other side of radical, we need to have much more honest conversations in the country about colonialism, extractivism, empire, where this country has got its wealth from, the history of the country. And this idea, I was on LBC a few weeks ago talking about this. I can't remember what had happened in the news story. I think one of the global South nations had talked about reparations. And they talked about the need for reparations, but even before we talked about financial reparations, for an apology for King Charles or whoever it might be, to recognise what had happened in the past, and to apologise for it. That's before we abolish his job, obviously, but while he's still there, that's something useful he could do. But anyway, the reason why I say this is because it's intrinsically linked with the climate crisis and the Industrial Revolution, and where we got our historical emissions from. And that's both on the international level, if we're talking about inequality, that the richest 1% of the globe burn more emissions than the poorest 2/3 of humanity. But of course, it's exactly the same in our towns, our cities, at the hyperlocal level, that those who have more in assets and unearned wealth are far too often taxed less, or not taxed at all, compared to people who are working for their income. And again, none of that stuff is what we need to pay for our public services, but we still need to make sure that these taxes are aligned, because it's about fairness and the signalling mechanisms that you make.
It's for us to teach people that it's not in order to bring money in if you're a monetary sovereign. Obviously, it's not the same for a council, but to understand that it's taxes at that level or for social engineering, and to understand what that means. And that it's the social engineering that the UK has gone through since the 1980s is a really bad form of social engineering that is making the country, very unequal, and creating a rise in mental health problems that are going to come, of course, because people feel put down upon and they feel like they're not succeeding and they're not getting forward in life.
Could I respond with one other thing too, which it's just interesting when you say the word radical. So I've been very outspoken, as lots of people have, about the need to stop selling arms to Israel. Before that, for a ceasefire in Gaza and for a Palestinian state. That doesn't feel radical. That feels common sense. It feels like the very obvious thing to say. Yeah, but in a very, very hostile media environment where, during the general election, I don't think I did almost a single interview without being asked if I was, if the party was anti-Semitic, or if I had an anti-Semitic problem, despite being one of the very few Jewish people in leadership positions in British political history. That's not radical, but it is radical in the context in which you're operating in. So I think it's always about what is the conversation that's happening and where are you placed within that conversation.
Yeah, you make a very good point. Absolutely,
Now, the process that happens in the United Kingdom is that the UK government decides what it wants to spend on England. It decides the priorities of England. It decides if it needs money for health, transportation, anything that's spent in England as the region. And as a byproduct of that, an amount is given to the devolved nations. So it might go up, it might go down. This time, I think it's going to go up by around about 3 billion. We're supposed to celebrate that £3 billion, you know. And one of the things I would love to be able to say to the Green Party in Westminster is that they've got to look, along with the SNP, at this fiscal settlement, this devolved settlement, because we have to treat the devolved nations as separate nations who've got their own priorities and their own needs. The idea that any nation should be happy having its budget set determined by what another nation needs is just the clearest example you could have of the position of the nations within the United Kingdom. Is there any scope, you think, for any kind of conversation across the UK about how we allocate funding to the devolved nations?
So Greens are already doing that, and it's actually not coming from Scotland because of Green Party of England and Wales, although I'm certain that our Scottish sister party would be very sympathetic to that argument, but because of the Welsh Green Party, of the Green Party of Wales, where the leader there, Anthony Slaughter, he talks about this actually. The most tangible example is in HS2, where there's a situation where HS2 is in no way benefiting Wales. In fact, I did a tour of Wales last year of the Green Parties there, and far too often you either have to get a train from England into Wales, back into England, back into Wales, yet they are still paying for it and not benefiting from it. I guess I'd even go so far as to extend the conversation too and say, I totally accept your point about nations, and that's particularly egregious. But I think it even is within cities within England. Like, why should the Westminster government, when there are city mayors, decide how that city spends its money? Like, either you trust in devolved and subsidised or subsidiarity, or you don't. Now, I agree, it's particularly much more egregious when it's another country or another nation, because you're it's rude more than anything, right? Rude is too soft, but it's just, you'd go, oh, we know better than you. We're not even in that nation, but we are going to decide all of those parameters. There clearly needs to be a massively different settlement for all of these. And I think the Brexit vote, again, was an example of that, where Scotland very clearly voted to leave, and Westminster were just like, nope, you're sticking with us. We're not giving you almost anything you want. We're going to tell you to piss off with your deposit bottle return scheme, which would clearly be a really important thing for the environment. We're going to trash all over your progressive stance on trans rights. We're going to ignore the wishes of your parliament, and we're going to decide how you're going to spend your. I mean, it is outrageous. So yes, there is absolutely scope, and I think we'll be continuing to speak about that. I guess my one challenge without being mealy-mouthed is obviously the MPs we have are MPs for specific constituencies where it is not an issue in their specific constituency, but it is still an issue of injustice wherever you are, and I think an issue of injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere.
Zack, thank you very much. We've had some great comments. We've got difficult to argue with common sense Zack's coming up with, which I think is the best thing anyone can say about a politician. Zack, see you later.
Thanks so much, and keep up the good work with the podcast.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.